Welcome to the briefing. Here's the other news you need to know this morning before we dive in to all of our stories. Last night, the EU tabled fixes to the Northern Ireland Protocol, some of which the bloc had previously rejected when the UK proposed them in previous years. This kicks off a month of new negotiations, and whilst no agreement is in the offing quite yet, it's not impossible that this new renegotiation could turn out to be a success, finding a settlement that both sides can live with. Is it really possible? Are we simply talking about more Brexit unicorns? We will be talking to two expert guests in just a few minutes' time. Chancellor Rishi Sunak is in Washington, D.C. today. He hosted a meeting of G7 finance ministers last night where they agreed to work together on the supply chain issues affecting all advanced economies. With claims that 1 million elf-on-the-shelf toys are stuck in China, can Christmas really be saved? We'll have expert analysis later in the show. And former Labour, now independent MP Claudia Webb was found guilty of harassment last night, including threatening to send intimate pictures and videos of a woman to her family and children and threatening to attack that same woman with acid. The judge raised the prospect of a custodial sentence which could start the chain of events necessary to trigger a by-election in her Leicester East constituency. We'll talk more on that later with another Leicestershire MP. And some good news. Cheap, cheerful and quick lateral flow tests are more accurate than previously thought. That's according to the University College London. Literally hundreds of millions of the tests were bought by the British government as part of its moonshot testing project, a decision that appears a little more vindicated today. Well, the Commons remains in recess and the Prime Minister remains in the Costa del Sol, but politics never stops. You're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Well, that biggest story to come out of yesterday, probably in international affairs regarding the United Kingdom, was, of course, the new proposals the EU is putting forward with regard to the Northern Ireland Protocol, in effect accepting that the situation as it currently stands is just not working. Well, let's get to dissecting some of those proposals now with Theresa Villiers, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, Conservative MP and, of course, leading Brexit campaigner. Welcome to the programme. Theresa, firstly, what do you make of these EU proposals? Potentially a lot further than anyone was expecting them to go in the last few months.
Well, this is a somewhat provisional view because obviously we've got to wait for the government and the experts to sort of grind through the detail. But the EU has gone a little further than I think people expected. And it is welcome that they do accept with these proposals that the status quo, how things are operating at the moment, is just not working. But I think these proposals aren't enough in themselves to resolve the problems with the protocol. And if we're going to find an agreed resolution on this, then a negotiated agreement has got to go a lot further in changing some of the key aspects of the protocol, not least is the involvement of the European Court of Justice.
This seemed to be what Lord Frost was saying 2 days ago when he was sort of saying that, yes, OK, we can agree to a lot of things, but if the ECJ is going to be there and interpret them so harshly, over-enforce them to the letter rather than the spirit, and have the bizarre situation where I think some tractors were being turned back because they had English mud on their tyres, which wasn't allowed in to Northern Ireland under some of the checks. I mean, surely the EU needs to recognise that the ECJ is a significant issue here.
Yes, that is going to be a big crunch point between the two sides as they start a fresh negotiating process. I mean, one of the things that is encouraging is that, you know, many people say, oh, well, you've signed up to the protocol, it can't be changed, you know, you're stuck with it, just sort of get used to it. But again, we have the EU acknowledging that they are prepared to look at change. They have actually in their proposal said they will change their own laws to try and resolve some of the issues that could see medication and pharmaceuticals more difficult to get from Britain to Northern Ireland. So there are some positives from all of this, but the continuing involvement of the European Court of Justice is completely out of line with how trade agreements work in the rest of the world. And that's what the protocol is, essentially. It's part of a trade agreement between the UK and the EU. And what Lord Frost was asking for just a day or two ago is only to bring the protocol in line with international trade arrangements the world over. So I don't think it's an unreasonable ask, but clearly it's going to be a tough one to get the European Union to agree to.
Now, 80% of checks on SPS checks being removed, 50% of paperwork being slimmed down. Is there not an argument here that some people will be saying, why doesn't the UK just accept this? Why risk blowing it all up? Why risk walking away? The EU has moved pretty significantly. Surely we should sort of take this not as a starting position, but as a finishing point.
Because it would still leave Northern Ireland, subjected to significant disadvantage in terms of frictions in trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It would still leave this line of separation, which I don't think is acceptable. And my worry also would still leave Northern Ireland subjected to a whole long list of laws over which they have no say at all, apart from a sort of one-off majoritarian vote every 4 years. So I think also we do have to look beyond the headlines. The EU do make the claim that 80% of food-related SPS checks would be dispensed with. I'm not sure that's quite true. And that also may be conditional on the UK agreeing to keep some of its food rules aligned with the European Union's, which would go against the principle of the Brexit vote that we should take back democratic control of our own laws in this country.
No, I think that's a really, really important point. One further point may be that although this is clearly more than the EU was considering a few months ago, the briefings at the beginning of this week, and indeed over the weekend to some sources close to the EU, were suggesting this sort of two-lane strategy, whereby goods destined for Northern Ireland would have no checks at all and goods going on to the Republic could be checked. It seems that that wasn't actually proposed in the end. Is there a chance here that the EU is keeping some of its gunpowder dry, setting out a starting position with room to move closer to the UK position as this month of negotiation goes on?
Well, I think there are elements of that two-lane track in what the EU is saying, and actually, indeed, it builds on what is already in the protocol, because this concept that you have tougher customs checks for goods which are perceived as at risk of going south of the border. I think there is sort of scope for sort of some kind of settlement, some kind of compromise, which could see goods and food which are clearly destined for Northern Ireland not subject to any checks at all. And I think that could potentially really help resolve some of the major problems with the protocol, and as I say, would be in line with a principle that's already accepted in the customs context. Lifting it and applying it to food-related checks as well might resolve a number of the serious problems. And after all, I think that the chief vet of Northern Ireland did indicate that around 20% of food-related checks in the whole European Union are now being carried out in relation to Northern Ireland to Great Britain to Northern Ireland trade. That's entirely disproportionate. So a two-lane strategy would help remedy that, but wouldn't resolve this problem about Northern Ireland essentially being locked into rules over which it doesn't have any say.
20% figure is extraordinary when you consider how few consumers relative to the rest of the EU actually live in Northern Ireland. My question here is, how did the EU let it get to this stage? Clearly, they believe that they've overstepped. They're now proposing some changes. But my gosh, why didn't we realise this a year ago?
Well, if one was cynical, one would say that this was partly an attempt to sort of demonstrate that Brexit comes with disadvantages. I think perhaps I hope the real reason isn't so sinister, in that the EU's SPS rules are designed as a one-size-fits-all model for every country from sort of Thailand to Peru to Indonesia. So they're really hyper-cautious, some would say even protectionist, and they're certainly not proportionate to food coming into the single market from a country like the United Kingdom, which arguably has rules on food safety which are just as strong as the EU's, and in some respects even tougher. And actually, the way the EU has approached it by applying the full scope of their SPS rules, apart from some grace periods, to this trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, they're not complying with the rules of international trade that say these kind of border-related food checks need to be based on evidence, proportionality, and risk. Applying that full set of checks without concessions to food from the UK is clearly disproportionate, particularly in the light of all the efforts the government is making to be transparent, to say to the EU, look, if you're worried about our food coming into your single market, then we'll be very transparent with our data, with the checks that we're making, so that you can see that we're doing everything possible to make sure that any food that does get into the single market is entirely compliant with single market rules.
Well, there are some really, hopeful noises there. I'm sure a story will be continuing to follow over the next month as negotiations go on. Teresa Villiers, thank you so much for joining us on the briefing on GB News this morning. Now, I'm delighted that we can continue this conversation with a DUP MP. Gregory Campbell is, of course, a long-standing DUP MP and joins me now. Gregory, first of all, what do you make of the EU suddenly deciding to move on this issue? Positive, no?
Yeah, it's positive as far as it goes. We did warn about these issues a year ago. Unfortunately, our own government, proceeded with them, but I think it's better late than never. If the EU are moving slightly, we have to look at why they moved and how they moved. For example, we had the ludicrous position over the past 10 months where supermarkets that only have units and stores in Northern Ireland and don't have them in the Republic, if they were bringing across goods and supplies from GB into those stores, even they had to be checked. And they physically could not go into the European single market. So that was clearly ludicrous. So that was just an example. The others you've seen in some news bulletins, the mountain of paperwork that many hauliers have had to put up with. So we've got to cut through all of that. Where people are supplying goods from one part of the UK to another part of the UK, i.e. from GB to NI, there shouldn't be any paperwork whatsoever. Now we've got to try and get either to that point or as close to that point as makes no difference. I think we've moved in that direction because the EU, I think, have had, Lord Frost and ourselves have applied pressure. That's good. Let's keep now the pressure on. Let's ensure that the negotiations start and hopefully they can reach a successful conclusion.
I can't help noticing that some of these things the EU are proposing, these technological solutions, these expanded trusted trader schemes, these are exactly the kinds of things that Brexiteers were saying for years that the EU dismissed out of hand. Why are they suddenly sort of singing from the Brexiteers' playbook? Couldn't we have arrived at this much, much earlier with a firmer negotiating stand?
Yeah, well, that's what many people are saying now. We were told the protocol couldn't be renegotiated. It was sacrosanct. It had to remain in place. And that was the position we were told for months. And now it appears it can be. We were told that all the trusted trader stuff and the technological advances that were being made and continue to be made couldn't possibly solve this problem. And now we're told that, well, yes, maybe they can. I think what we have to come back to here is an issue I raised both with the EU and with our own government. What you have to remember is that Northern Ireland and the Republic have a land border that is almost 300 miles long. But in that 300-mile length of land border, there are over 280 crossing points. Everyone should understand that that makes it physically impossible, even if there was a desire to have one, to have a hard border on the island of Ireland. That's simply not going to happen. Unfortunately, the EU used that as the prospect of peace being in jeopardy if a hard border had to be implemented. So I think if our government takes the position now, which is that everyone understands there's not going to be checks on the island of Ireland, so let's look at this proposal that was put to us many months ago by others, including unionists, and now which the EU, have decided may actually work. the trusted trader, the technological advances that are available. Let's look at that and build on that to make a fluid situation possible so that we can get back to what everyone wants, which is good business flow between east-west and a good business flow between north-south as well.
Is it the case here that the EU is just too legalistic an institution to deal with somewhere as delicate as Northern Ireland? As we know, in so many agreements, discretion is really required. And when you have the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, adjudicating on issues, they'll take things to the letter of the law rather than perhaps the spirit of the cooperative nature of the protocol. I wonder whether it's possible to have the sort of discretion that's really needed, potentially a blind eye being turned here and there to maintain the unique situation of peace in Northern Ireland. Is the EU as an institution capable of that kind of delicate behaviour?
I think that's a very difficult question to answer. The history of the EU, I'm afraid, is that it is indeed a very legalistic monolith which moves very, very slowly to try and deal with problems. For example, the European Court of Justice would come into play whenever there may be, for example, divergence in the future between trading regulations that would apply only in the UK or only in the EU. Where does Northern Ireland then fit within that? It would clearly be untenable if you had the European Court of Justice only deliberating upon what happens whenever divergence occurred and who would arbitrate and what would the appeal mechanism be. So we have to try and find a way that on either side of any potential dispute that would happen, and disputes happen with the EU, as Poland are finding out now, and many other countries, Greece found out, how do you resolve in a mutually satisfactory way any problem that emerges with a monolith that has 27 nation states and other nation states looking to join, to come to ask for more money off the table of the net contributors, which we unfortunately were for many years?
Finally, in this conversation, in brief, if you will, what did you make of the assertion from Dominic Cummings this week that the protocol was signed up to with always the idea that it would be changed and scrapped afterwards? How does that make you feel as someone representing people in Northern Ireland, that this was potentially not used, that this was potentially a political tool that of both sides, really, rather than seeking the best interests of the people you represent?
Well, I suppose the Article 16 provision always allowed on either side for someone to say, look, this is not working, so we're going to have to withdraw our support for elements of it. But I do think what we must take into context here is that Dominic Cummings left Downing Street under somewhat of a cloud. So I think in any circumstance like this, you have to view comments made by someone who leaves and they're referring to their previous employer in a certain way. You have to take that into account whenever you're deliberating upon any context in which they're speaking.
Gregory Campbell, of course, DUP MP for East Londonderry. Thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. Really interesting stuff. Now, I want to quickly turn to the front page of the Metro today, which splashes with Prince William, usually the sensible one, decrying our new burgeoning golden era of space exploration. The second in line to the throne declared to the BBC, who else, that we need some of the world's greatest brains and minds fixed on trying to repair this planet, not on trying to find the next place to go and live. Now, sorry, Prince William, but I'm not entirely convinced that some of the world's most successful and innovative people should be taking all that many lectures from someone who holds their position by an accident of birth. Even if you do manage to do it a little bit better than your brother. Now, for 30 years, consistently, the cost of getting a kilogram into orbit was $18,500. It was stagnant and prohibitively expensive. Well, today, that cost is just $2,720, almost 1/10 of the previous price. The reason we're suddenly seeing billionaires going into space isn't because William Shatner is suddenly much more rich. It's because the cost of spaceflight is suddenly much lower. Sure, still too high for you and me, but given the way it's going, maybe not for long. The first orbital-class boosters were landed and reused less than a decade ago. And now a fully rapidly reusable rocket is being developed by SpaceX. Once finished, Starship, as it's called, will be able to ferry people about like an aeroplane, with the only significant cost being fuel. We're on the precipice of something incredibly exciting, all being led by market innovation. We're entering an era where we may be able to expend fewer resources on exploration for stratospherically bigger returns and better results. More for less, the essence of growth. But why has it suddenly become cheaper, and why have we suddenly seen a spurt of innovation reminiscent of the 1960s? Because of competition, because of private sector innovation. And it means instead of the US government having to spend 5% of its total budget on NASA as it did in the 1960s, it spends less than half of 1% on it today. And despite this, we're returning to the moon this decade, Mars not long after. The original space race was expensive but miraculous. Looking back, it was, yes, bonkers to wastefully throw away the multi-billion-dollar rocket that every time it was flown. Yet, even with big state, arguably relatively wasteful innovation like that, miraculous discoveries were made that helped life on Earth just as much as it helped our understanding of the universe. Who would have thought that the Apollo program, aimed at beating the Soviets, would be responsible for fireproof firefighter uniforms, thermal blankets, advanced cameras, bridge shock absorbers, advances in computing, vacuum-sealed food, freeze-dried food, and shock-absorbing sports shoe soles? Opposing innovation is never a good look. Holding back progress puts you on the wrong side of history. Prince William should learn from his late great-grandfather, Prince Philip. Reportedly fascinated by the moon landings, he met Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins in 1969. He even visited the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center in 2007. Prince Philip understood the importance of science, of innovation, and of exploration. And the world's brilliant billionaires should follow his example, not his grandson's. Well, moving on. The MP for Leicester East, Claudia Webb, has been found guilty of harassment. Let's find out a little bit more about this from a neighbour of hers in the same region, that is. Andrew Bridgen, of course, is the Member of Parliament for North West Leicestershire, and I believe can join us now. Andrew, first of all, did this result come as a bit of a surprise or not at all?
The verdict of the judge? No, I think it was expected. I think it's been expected in Parliament and across Leicester itself. It's been fairly unedifying for all parliamentarians. I understand that Claudia may well be appealing against this decision, so I think the by-election that we're all expecting may be some months away, or if she does what I think would be the decent thing and resign now, to allow a by-election, and certainly Leicester East, with all its problems, historic and current, it desperately needs strong representation.
And to be fair, the Labour Party has called on Claudia Webb, who is, of course, elected under their banner. They've called on her to resign. But interestingly, in the trial, a character witness statement was given by none other than Jeremy Corbyn, standing up for the woman who was found guilty of harassing, found guilty of threatening another woman with acid, threatening a woman of sending intimate photos of her to her children. How on earth did Jeremy Corbyn give a character statement here?
Well, it wasn't just Jeremy Corbyn, was it? I understand John McDonnell came out in support of Claudia, and so did Diane Abbott. Claudia was parachuted into Leicester East as the candidate when the previous incumbent, Keith Vaz, was mired in the cocaine and rent boys scandal, and so he stood down at the last minute. I actually understand that Claudia was as a councillor in Islington, was sort of scheduled to take over from Jeremy Corbyn in Islington North at the next election. And so she was sort of a candidate of somewhat last resort. It's fair to say that she's not visited Leicester on many occasions. She still lives in London, and she's not very well regarded in the constituency. And I think if it were put to a recall vote, I don't think there's any doubt that there would be a recall and a by-election triggered by that.
And of course, it would be 10% of the constituents that would need to trigger that that by-election, that recall by-election. It's interesting. The constituents of Leicester East seem to have had a really tough time of it recently. You mentioned the previous incumbent, also a Labour MP in that seat, has had scandals of his own, and now Claudia Webb. I mean, what will it take for the people of Leicester East to get a scandal-less MP?
Well, Keith Vaz represented the seat. The last time it was Conservative was Peter Broomvelds before 1987. Vaz was there from 87 till 2019, 32 years as the MP. As we know from recent headlines, it's a constituency that's mired in its own problems of modern slavery in the textile industry, exploitation of workers. Topics that I never heard Keith Vaz ever raise once in the chamber when he was representing the seat where it was all going on. Now they've got Claudia Webb. Claudia's majority in 2019 was just over 6,000 votes, down from Vaz's 24,000 majority. So we had a big swing to the Conservatives in 2019. But my message to the people of Leicester is it's a red city. Red City Council, Labour City Council. You can't keep voting the same way and expect the problems that have been incumbent for so many decades to be solved. We've now got a Conservative Police and Crime Commissioner since May, and we're seeing real changes. They need to vote Conservative if they want to change the city.
By-election does take place. It will be an absolutely fascinating one to watch, and we no doubt will be bringing the viewers of GB News all of the twists and turns as this story develops. Andrew Bridgen, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Now, shoppers can be reassured that ministers are doing absolutely everything they can to fix the supply chain issues in the UK. That's what Chancellor Rishi Sunak has said. In recent days, several retailers have warned of potential shortages during the Christmas shopping season. Well, David Buick is a business expert at Aquis Exchange, and he joins us now. Welcome to the programme. The Chancellor has been in Washington, D.C. this week, emphasising the global nature of this problem. Is he right?
Morning, Tom. Lovely to speak to you. But before I say anything, could I just say I profoundly disagree with you over Prince William. I believe that if you look at the front page of the Financial Times this morning, you'll see that in the United States of America, £500 billion worth of profits, dollars, have been made out of IPOs in the tech sector. London, and more to the point, the United Kingdom, is the fintech centre of the world. I think Prince William's comments were taken out of context. I think he's very pro-technology and the rest of it. I just think he thinks outer space can wait because we've got serious problems. Forgive me for interjecting here, but I just think he's the most wonderful ambassador. And, I think the thing should be put into context. Now, let me answer your question. On the question of the supply chain, we've had nothing in this country but political criticism about the supply chain, people blaming Brexit, Tom, and all this sort of thing. The supply chain is a dramatic problem all over the world. This week, there were 71 ships waiting to unload in San Diego. The previous week, 42 ships waiting to unload in Los Angeles. You only had to look at the pictures of Felixstowe yesterday to see, I believe there are 50,000 containers there. And this is partly, of course, caused by a lack of drivers in the United Kingdom. But the heavy goods vehicle driving situation, as I understand it, even with Joe Biden having to interject yesterday, is a global problem. And China, of course, having started this pandemic, got out of it more quickly than anybody else. And then you get this sort of domino effect of everybody, suddenly the whole world recovers. They didn't want anything, didn't want any steel, they didn't want any iron ore, they didn't want any wood, they didn't want any plastic. And suddenly the whole world wants it. And so when you even look around your room and you look at your sockets in the wall and your various knobs that you see on your cupboards and various things, these things are all made in China. And so you get this supply chain problem, which is a very serious one. And it has actually triggered inflation, the like of which we've not seen for a very long time, probably not since the days of Anthony Barber. I mean, that was up at 21% in those days. And we're likely to get to 6% by Christmas. And that is, in my humble opinion, hopefully temporary. Because if we can iron out this question of the supply chain, because this inflation is supply driven, not demand driven. And I think there's a distinct difference. And if it was demand driven, then I think the central banks of the world would have a right to put interest rates up now instead of waiting until January or February. I fear that the Bank of England could get bullied into putting a symbolic one at the end of December. I think that would be wrong, because I think it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater just when you're trying to get impetus going. And when you think of all the people who've got higher taxation to deal with, higher mortgage interest rates to pay, all kinds of other things, they've got enough on their plate and enough cost of living rises without another interest rate increase. But this is a global problem. And I think the way the retailers have finally looked at it, saying, look, don't wait until the last 2 weeks before Christmas. Get your act together. Get what you really need, whether it's toys. I mean, a lot of people, I read yesterday, like 490,000 Christmas puds were apparently sold, which I thought was fantastic and shows a little bit of foresight. And I think if we're all sensible...
That point's interesting. Should people be we're hearing politicians say, no, just shop normally, don't panic buy. That will cause the same situation we saw at petrol stations if everyone rushes to buy their Christmas goods all at once. But you're saying potentially there's some prudence here in terms of getting your puddings in now.
Well, certain items, so that we don't, I think if we all go crackers and go off to the supermarket or go off to John Lewis or wherever you shop, the rest of it, and just back the truck up and just load everything up like we had at the start of the first pandemic, then I think we've got a real problem. And this supply chain is going to be, significantly worse than it should be. But I think if you just, buy little bits and pieces from various sectors that you need, if we all are sensible about the way we set about it. I mean, the petrol thing, what was interesting yesterday, Tom, and I'm sure you picked up on it, Asda, we've got, I think, 5,300 out of 8,800 petrol stations saying no supply problem for a week. Now, that's good news. That doesn't mean it's the same all over the country. We know the southeast, particularly places like Kent and Surrey and London, have been hammered. But on the whole, I think, the point has been very clearly made. And what annoyed me, I mean, I don't use my car. I mean, I do 4,000 miles a year. So when I fill up, it's for 6 weeks. But when I was there were blokes with jerry cans at 5 in the morning, tipping. I mean,
that's irresponsible behaviour. But I'm afraid we've run out of time on this interview and indeed the programme. But whilst there are some worries there, potentially some solutions down the line. David Buick, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning. And thank you to all of my guests this morning as well. Thank you for watching. After the break, we'll be here with Patrick Christys and Mercy Mroki for To The Point. But first, here's the weather.
Hello, good morning.